Well, I was getting ready to, I thought I had my sermon all figured out, and then Jackie's saying good father. And it completely threw my hook off a little bit. I was going to tell you a story talking about good fathers. As a therapist, I've said this before, I tend to be a little bit of a weird therapist. When I'm meeting with teenagers especially, I like to use words that are a little, I don't know if provocative is the right word, but they tend to provoke things in people a little bit, especially parents, because I will tell parents often when I'm meeting with teenagers, I said, I love being a therapist, and I love being a therapist of teenagers because I'm going to teach your teenager how to rebel and how to manipulate you. And they all look at me like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. And I then do go on to explain a little bit that it is one of those, the reason I say rebel is because that's really the developmental age of teenagers. They're learning to be their own person. They're kind of separating themselves from their parents and from their families of origin. And so it's just the natural, normal developmental phase that teenagers find themselves in. My job is to help them navigate that in healthy ways. So I'm not going to teach them bad rebellion. I'm just hopefully going to help them along their journey in their human development along the way. Manipulation, I keep getting told I need to stop using that word by my wife and by the other therapists that I work with. I need to change it and say strategic, that I'm not manipulative, and I don't teach them to be manipulative. I teach them to be strategic. That probably is true. Again, I use the word because it is. The teenagers quickly tune in and go, what? Manipulate? Oh, what are we going to do? That sounds really interesting here, kind of a thing. And it really is strategy. It's teaching teenagers. If you want to go to the concert on Friday and all your homework is done, and then you ask mom and dad, they don't have a reason to say no. You've now manipulated your parents to say yes to you going to this thing. When I'm teaching parenting classes, I teach them to manipulate their kids as well. We talk about kids struggling, especially as kids are starting to eat solid foods and things like that. I teach parents, I said, give them a choice on what they're going to eat, but you're the parent. Put parameters around it. What's the thing that you want them to do? You want them to eat their vegetables. Now, don't feed them asparagus and Brussels sprouts. Just don't do it. There's other vegetables. We learned last time I preached that God doesn't like asparagus and Brussels sprouts. Well, okay, maybe not, but I don't. But I tell them, I say, manipulate your kid a little bit. Because kids do want choice, especially young children. Part of their developmental phase is they're trying to learn how to make decisions for themselves and things like that. They want freedom. Toddlers, terrible twos. It's time to go. Put your shoes on. I'll do it myself. No, I'll do it myself. Oh, I can't. They're wanting to do these things on their own. So we tell them, as parents, give them some choice. I want them to eat their vegetables. Do you want peas? Do you want carrots? I don't care which one, as long as you eat one. And the kid then feels like they have a choice and these kinds of things. So this manipulation I say manipulation because teenagers think it sounds really cool. It really is kind of this strategy kind of a thing. And as we begin to look, we're gonna kind of wrap up the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and we're gonna look at two different stories. We're gonna pick up on the tail end of Noah and then the last story. But we're gonna as we do this, I want to kind of look at this good father. We've heard many stories. That was what threw me for a loop as that song started. We've heard many stories of the kind of father that you are. And today we're going to kind of continue that. But you see in this kind of another simplification, summary of where we've been, this journey that we've been on. Genesis is 50 chapters long, but it's divided into two sections. First section is chapters 1 through 11. Second half, 12 through 50. We see 1 through 11 actually is really talking about God in the world. God's interaction with the world, what's going on in the world, those kinds of things. We'll pivot in a couple of weeks, and we'll start looking at God and his interaction with Abraham's family. And we see this little loop in this drawing here. This again is a drawing that we pull off of the Bible Project. The video that we showed at the beginning of this series comes from the Bible Project, things like that. For those of you that have been keeping up on your chiasms in these verses and things like that, there's a reason that loop is there. Genesis is one actually huge chiasm itself, kind of a thing. But just kind of a summary where we've been. Genesis starts with this dark nothingness, darkness, and God creates. And he creates and he says that it's good. That all that he created was good. And then he creates humankind and says that it is very good. But in the midst of that, he gives humanity this choice. Are you going to choose my way and choose that I get to determine what is good and what is evil? Or are you going to choose for yourself? He says, don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just choose what I'm telling you. But we see that humanity chooses not to do that. And Eve eats of the fruit and Adam eats of the fruit. And it represents this way in which we as humans tend to do that. We tend to choose to be our own gods and make our own decisions about what is good and what is evil. And then the chapters continue on to begin to show the consequences of that. We see that Adam and Eve, in their choices of that, some of the first consequences we see is they feel shame. And in their shame, there's broken relationship because they hide. And then they start blaming one another. Then we go into Cain, who gets really jealous of his brother. And out of his jealousy and his turning on to himself to try and wanting to make himself better, ends up killing his brother. And he separates himself from the presence of God. And then we hear this story of Lamech. Lamech is this guy who comes in the line of Cain, and he's bragging about how violent and vicious he is and how he has accumulated his wives. We continue to see this spiral of the world just continuing to get worse and worse and worse. And last week, and there's some other stories in there. There's one about the Nephilim and things like that, which again, whether it's, we talked a little bit about it in our Sunday night group, kind of where is that? What is that? Some talk about it being angels. Others talk about it just kings claiming to be God ordained and gods themselves. But regardless, what it leads to is just this continued debauchery, and the world turns into this evil place. Where last week when Jackie was preaching, she talks about God looked at the earth and saw that there was no good thought that was there. And then we tell the story of Noah. And we looked at the nature of God in that story. That God in that story was different than the gods of that age that were telling similar stories and things like that. But this God remembered. He remembered his creation. He did find the one who was good and saved Noah and his family. This is the nature of this God, that this God in the midst of this chaos and this continuing spiral downward, God remembers and wants to save and rescue. And so we find ourselves right there, kind of at the end of that, and God has rescued them. They're on the boat, and they get ready to come off of the boat. And we begin to hear this story, and that's where we're going to pick up today. We're going to pick up in chapter 9 of Genesis, in verse 18. And we're going to read through this together. We're going to skip over a few things. There's some genealogies that we're going to skip over, and then we're going to end in another, right at the end, 11, with the Tower of Babel. And that kind of ends up wrapping up our chapter 11 before we make this pivot. But so we're here with Noah, and the ark has come to rest, and they're beginning to move forward. And so, again, chapter 9, starting in verse 18, let's read together. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil. He planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, father of Canaan, saw his nakedness of his father and told his two brothers who were outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done and said to him, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. And let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All of his days, Noah was 950, and he died. Now, as we've been going through this, some of the things that we've been asking is kind of, what are some of the problems that we see in the text? What are some things that kind of make us go, hold on a minute, why is that there, and how does that make any sense whatsoever? And one of them is, what was the problem with Noah's drunkenness? Why, and nakedness? I mean, we look at it from our current day context, and we know that nakedness is something that you cover up. We all wear clothes, and we assume some things and that kind of stuff. But it's a question. Why? What's the problem with this? What is it that Noah did that was so bad? Kind of a thing. The other thing that I thought came up a little bit in some of the reading and podcasts I'm listening to, the question, why does he curse Canaan? Isn't Ham the one that came in and saw him that way? So why does he curse Ham's son? Ham's the one that did something to him. Ham's the one that walked in and saw him. But instead he curses Canaan. So these are some questions that we see arising in this text. I grew up in a pretty conservative denomination. And so I was always taught that the problem with Noah's sin after this was his drunkenness. I grew up in a very dry denomination. We were not allowed to touch alcohol whatsoever. So that was what I was taught, and I think there's some truth to that. I think, what I learned growing up, I don't think that drinking alcohol is necessarily a problem, but I do see throughout Scripture that there are times where it says, don't become drunk with wine. Why? What's the issue there? As a therapist, it's within my scope of practice to practice hypnotherapy. I don't do it. And I don't do it for the same reason that I think drunkenness is a problem. Drunkenness is a problem because we lose control of our own decision-making process. I was having a conversation with somebody recently. I don't remember who it was. But we're talking about it, and they're like, I know exactly what I'm doing when I'm drunk. I just continue to do it even though I know it's wrong. It's weird. I don't know why. I said, because that's what alcohol does. It lowers our inhibitions, and we just, it's wrong to drive, but you still do it anyhow, kind of a thing. So I think there's some of that I think is true in this, in Noah's drunkenness, and his nakedness, again, some of the shame that's there. But there's some other things that I thought was interesting in this. It talks about Noah planted the vineyard. It doesn't say God created this vineyard. It says Noah took it on himself, and he does this. He creates this vineyard. He makes the wine, and then he doesn't know when to say enough. He doesn't know when to stop. Now, another little tidbit that you don't pick up in this, one of the things that we talk about in our Sunday night thing is we talk a little bit about some of the Jewish perspective. From a Jewish reading of this part of the story, this actually parallels the story of the fall. And so in the story of the fall, we have a garden, but God made the garden. In this, we have a garden or a vineyard, but Noah made the vineyard. And in that garden, God, as he was creating, knew when to stop creating and rest. And in this story, Noah doesn't know when to stop. And so he continues on. And so I think there's some of that as well. We talk about how what we're trying to do in these passages is take another look through a different window that brings some additional truth. We're not trying to take away what we've always known, but there's some other things that I think we can learn through these. And so in this, we see that Noah didn't know when to say enough. But God is a God who knows when to say enough and stop creating. Why did he curse Canaan? It's another one. Well, Ham's the one that walked in and saw him drunk and naked laying there. Why does he begin to take it out on Canaan? Well, there's a couple of things, and I don't know totally all of this, but as I begin to, again, study some of this, hearing from a Jewish perspective a little bit, within the Jewish understanding of this story, it comes from the Jewish Midrash, which is a commentary. It's an additional, we have, as pastors, we have Bible commentaries that we use to help us understand what was going on in the text. Jewish faith has the same kind of thing. They have these commentaries. They actually think that the reason that he curses Canaan is an indication of what happened in the tent. I'm not totally sure I understand all of that, but what I do understand and what they do talk about, regardless of what the sin was and why it was there, they recognize that Noah overstepped his bounds. He should have cursed Ham, but instead he curses Canaan. And if you notice that, I'm trying to use the Jewish pronunciation. We say Canaan, right? Where do we hear that later on? We actually often today will talk about how what's going on in the Middle East is an ongoing 1,000-year split and rivalry. From a Jewish perspective, it didn't start with Ishmael and Isaac. They actually say it starts here, when Noah curses Canaan. And actually, when you begin to read some of the lineage and you see who the children of Canaan are, you begin to see some of the nation states that Israel does get into conflict with throughout the Old Testament. So there's some of this that's there. They say that Noah overstepped his bounds. He didn't know how to say enough destruction. We just saw in the story of Noah that God destroyed the earth to rebuild it, but he knew when to say enough and stop. He knew to remember Noah and save him, but Noah doesn't. Noah takes out vengeance not only on Ham, but his descendants. He doesn't know when to say enough destroying. Those become the sins of Noah. As good as Noah was, he still is human and he still falls. And part of this journey that we're on is recognizing the fall of humanity. And so Noah does some good things, but as he comes back out of the ark, there's some things that he fails at. And he fails kind of miserably at them in doing them. And so humanity continues to get worse again. And we find ourselves coming down to where humanity now has begun to spread themselves. We're going to skip over the genealogy that is in there, and we're going to jump to chapter 11, where we come to that last story where we begin one of the Tower of Babel. And in this, I want us to hear again the nature of this God that is in this story. Now the whole earth, we're going to start in chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Random side note, they went east. Up to this point, every time people moved, they move east. And in a Jewish perspective, that becomes very, very meaningful because it's the move away from God as they move east. Come, let us burn them thoroughly. And they used the bricks for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, come, let us build a city for ourselves, and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens. Let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Then the Lord came down to the city and to the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they pursue will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, the name was called Babel, because the Lord confused their language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Again, I want us to kind of take a look at some of the problems. What are some of the problems that we see in this? What is the problem that God has with what they're doing? We're also going to ask, I have the question, what is God's solution to this? And often when we look at the solution, it doesn't say that he curses them, but we're going to look at this as a curse. Does God curse them? Does God inflict something on them? And if he does, what is the impact? So what's the problem that God had? When we read this passage, there's a nifty, interesting little thing I learned in reading it from a Jewish perspective. When you're reading from a Jewish perspective and it says, and they said, da la 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 la. If it's one conversation, they keep going. But if they say it and then stop, and then they say, and then God said, and then God said, that's read as three different conversations. And so one of the things that was really interesting to me is, as we read through this, it talks about how they come together, and it says, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And God doesn't respond. And they used the bricks, and then they said, so from a Jewish reading, those are two different conversations. There was something that happened and then something. It says, and then they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens. Let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered across the earth. Then the Lord comes down. And so as we read this from that Jewish perspective, they talk about, from a Jewish perspective, how the issue was not the technology. This is Old Testament, but they're talking about technology. They're talking about the iPhone, the iPad of its day, the brick, right? God didn't have a problem with the technology. God didn't have a problem with them building the city. He didn't really have a problem with them building the tower. He didn't have a problem with them using the technology because there's no response. And then they said, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower that will reach the heavens and make a name for ourselves. And God responds. He comes in. He shows up. He says, let's see what's going on here. Therein lies the problem. That they were able to, he recognized they were able to do anything, and they were choosing for themselves without the need of reflecting God. They were again choosing their own way, was the issue that God had in this situation with them. And so he says, come, let us go down and confuse their language. So what does God do? How does he respond to this? He confuses their language. But there's something interesting to me that I think God might be a little, strategic. Because in this, he says to them, I'm going to confuse your languages. And in confusing their languages, they can't now have to find different ways to be successful, to use this technology, to build these cities, to live together in harmony. What does it take to live in harmony, to live in unity? We've talked before about how God's desire is for us to be in unity, in harmony with one another. What does it take to do that, especially when you have somebody who speaks another language? You actually have to act the way in which God acts. In order for me to interact with somebody who has a different language than mine, I have to restrain myself. I have to stop. I have to listen. I have to see them. I have to learn about them. I have to know when to say enough of my own. I can't demand everything that you've got to come meet me. I've got to set aside myself too to meet them. I think in this curse, and I don't know if any of you have noticed that my title on the slides is different than the title in your bulletin, and that's just simply because we're combining two of these. The misplaced curse, where Noah misplaced the curse and says, I'm going to curse Canaan. He misplaced it. He overstepped his bounds. But I think this is in some ways a misplaced curse. Because I think what God does in this is not give us a curse. There is a punishment. There's a purpose for what he's doing. There's something he needs to stop. He knows if he doesn't intervene and stop, that the world will continue down its downward spiral. And he needs to do something to slow it down. And so he does. He confuses their languages. But in confusing their languages, he does something I think very unique in that it forces us, if we're truly going to overcome it, to be like him. I think we see this in a lot of the curses or punishments. I think we see this in a lot of God's law. I love to refer to the 10 Commandments as the 10 natural laws, not commands, but natural law. Because I don't care if you believe in who God is or not. You are under those laws. God's way of intervening with us forces us, if we want that freedom, if we want that welcomeness, we have to do it his way. What do I mean? Gravity is a real thing. If I jump off here, I'm going to fall. If I lie to someone, I'm going to break relationship. It's not about whether or not I'm a believer or not. This is just the way God says this is the way it's going to work. And if you want it to work, you got to do it my way. And I think that's part of what he's saying he does in this curse. And again, he doesn't call it a curse in this because I don't think he thinks of it as a curse. But he confuses their languages, and it forces us as humanity. If we want to succeed, if we want to be successful, we have to behave like God. We have to know our limits and where I end and the other begins, and I have to stop and I have to listen and I have to set aside who I am to hear the other. If it's in my own language, it's really easy and I can very quickly just brush it off. I think it's interesting again, I call it a misplaced curse because I don't know that it's a real curse. I think it's God's way of trying to say, I have the answer. Do you trust me? Will you come back into relationship with me? If you do it my way, if you choose my way, which again is a reoccurring theme through this whole thing, will you choose to do it my way? We can build these towers. We can use the technology to all kinds of good if we do it God's way. But if we choose to do it our own, in our own way, we continue to spread eastward. We know that this story is the beginning, and we're going to talk next week. We're going to kind of wrap these up. This is the preface, because we're going to make this pivot to where God continues to intervene, and we're going to begin to look at the story and where it begins of the whole arc of his redemptive nature. And we're going to look towards Christ, because this points to Jesus. ultimately everything in this story points to Christ. There's something that we celebrated last week, and Jackie's going to talk a little bit more about. I'm going to invite the worship team forward. But we didn't mention it last week. We didn't talk about it. But on the church calendar, from the liturgical calendar standpoint, last week was called Pentecost. And there was something that was unique that took place on that day. Because thousands of years before, God confused their language. But on Pentecost, on that day, as Christ had come and entered into the world and come and died and was rose again, and he ascended into heaven, his followers were told, go and wait. Wait for the Spirit to come. And when it comes, there was something that happened that day. And all of those languages on that day in Jerusalem heard. There was a unifying force that came through the Spirit. They heard in their own language. They heard the story of this God who created them and said, you are good. You are mine. You failed, but I love you. And I've made a way. And I'm going to continue to make a way. And all the languages heard. All the languages are unified in the voice of that Spirit that flows through us. And so we're going to close with this song.